At the time I'm recording this video, MLB is in the midst of a massive labor lockout, which is quickly becoming the largest MLB labor dispute since the 1994 players' strike. Because of this, a lot of people have correctly placed a ton of blame on MLB and, in particular, Commissioner Rob Manfred, with many calling him the worst commissioner ever for this and many of the other things that he's done over the course of his tenure. However, while he's done a ton of terrible things for baseball during his tenure, in my opinion, I feel like calling him the worst commissioner ever may be jumping the gun a bit. And the only reason I say that is because the man before him may have been worse. What if I told you that Manfred's predecessor was responsible for almost destroying baseball? Not just once, but twice. And not only did he get to be commissioner for over 20 years after the fact, but he also got rewarded with a plaque in Cooperstown. It's time for us to take a hard look at the real legacy of Bud Selig, the commissioner. By the end of this video, I'm going to be showing you why he, without a doubt, is the worst commissioner that MLB has ever had, and honestly, might ever have. Let me explain. Okay, so who actually is Bud Selig? Well, the story of Alan H. Selig begins and ends in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. It was where he was born, it was where he was raised, it was where he went to school, it was where he inherited his father's small car leasing dealership and ultimately made his first fortune. The kind of money that allowed you to buy a stake in an MLB franchise. He got his start in Major League Baseball as the largest public shareholder of the Braves, who at that time were still in Milwaukee. However, when he found out that the team was planning on moving and heading down to Atlanta, he sold all of his stock that he had in the team, and he made it his personal mission to bring Major League Baseball back to Milwaukee, a goal that, to his credit, he actually succeeded in. In 1970, he would successfully buy the Seattle Pilots, who had just gone bankrupt after their first season in Major League Baseball. In doing so, he moved the team from Seattle to Milwaukee and renamed them the Brewers after the longtime minor league team that he and his family would watch all the time when he was a kid. Over the next 22 years, Selig would serve as the principal owner and the main decision maker of the ball club. But to say that he was successful in this role is a bit of an overstatement. Sure, they made the World Series in 1982, but over the course of his entire tenure as owner, the Brewers only finished in first place in their division just twice, and throughout most of it, they would spend most of their time either at or near the bottom of their division. While there are plenty of reasons why they were consistently bad for so long, it's hard not to blame at least some of it on his frugality. You see, Selig was not a fan of paying his players what they were worth, and he especially did not like paying for free agent contracts. So much so that during the mid to late 1980s, he became a key player in one of the biggest collusion scandals in MLB history, where a bunch of the owners colluded together to purposely drive down the wages of free agent players. Now, you might be asking yourself, well, how much money did they actually steal from the players in doing this? I mean, it is the 1980s after all, salaries weren't that crazy, so how much did it actually cost? 10 million? 20 million? Maybe 30? Well, what if I told you that the eventual payout was $280 million? And that's not even today's money, that was back then money. If you account for inflation, that total payout was probably near $500 million in today's money. It's so hard to overstate just how bad of a look this was for MLB and its owners. But for Bud Selig, it actually worked out kinda well for him. Not only did he avoid any major repercussions for his actions, but he was actually rewarded a few years later by the owners by being named as acting commissioner of baseball. And in fact, he was so well beloved in the role that they gave him the actual title of commissioner in 1998. Now, to be fair to him, there were a few good things that came about as a result of his 20 plus years as commissioner. For example, there was the official merger of the AL and the NL under the commissioner's office, there was the start of interleague play, and the start of the World Baseball Classic, among other things. However, even even with these minor victories strewn about his 20 years as commissioner, it's hard not to look back at his entire body of work as an abject failure for baseball. One that almost completely destroyed baseball's public image and popularity and led to a lot of the problems that Manfred and his contemporaries are facing today. And a lot of this stems from 3 major issues that came about during his commissionership. Of course, we can't talk about the tenure of Bud Selig without talking about the crisis that started it all, that being the 1994 players' strike. Much like the lockout we're seeing today, the strike was mainly caused by MLB, the commissioner, and the owners all acting in bad faith, and it was the culmination of a perfect storm of labor issues. At that point, the current version of the CBA had been expired for nearly a year. And not to mention the fact that MLB was still reeling from the consequences of a $280 million collusion scandal, of which the acting commissioner was a main organizer. So needless to say, tensions were very, very high heading into the 1994 season. And when Selig and the owners unveiled their demands at the midway point of that year, things went from bad to much, much worse. When you hear people talk about the 1994 strike, especially back then, the main narrative that tends to get pushed is that this was a matter of millionaires versus billionaires and that the greedy players just wanted more money for themselves to play a kid's game. But the fact of the matter is that this strike was less about the players wanting more money for themselves and more about stopping the owners from taking the money that they already had. Selig's demands were based around 4 main pillars, all of which were complete non-starters for the union. Among other things, they wanted to cut the players' share of revenue by 6 percentage points, they wanted to completely get rid of the arbitration process, they wanted to take a percentage of players' licensing revenues, and most importantly, they wanted to implement a salary cap. Of course, it's no secret that the owners have been wanting to implement a salary cap for decades now, and as a result, it became the main sticking point of the negotiations between the owners and the Players Association. The owners claimed that it was the only way for small market teams to compete in an era of high player salaries. However, I think most people saw it for what it was, which was a built-in excuse for cheap owners to not pay players what they were actually worth. And that was the main reason why the players fought back so hard on specifically this proposal. However, it's important to note here that the Players Association wasn't exactly being unreasonable here. In fact, they came back with their own counterproposal, one that kept most of the status quo intact and even offered a competitive balance tax in lieu of a salary cap. But unfortunately for the Players Association, Selig and the owners weren't exactly interested in negotiating in good faith. And so instead of coming to the negotiating table and trying to work out a deal, or at the very least, try and push things off until the end of the season, they decided to needlessly antagonize the Players Association in an effort to try and get them to cave in to their demands. A good example of this came on August 1st, when Selig withheld a $7.8 million payment to the Players' Pension Fund, a move that served no real strategic purpose other than to antagonize the Players Association even further. And I guess in that regard, it kinda worked. Just 12 days later, the threat of a strike went from vague posturing by the union to an actual reality. But even with the worst case scenario now staring them directly in the face, Selig and the owners decided to double and triple down on their posturing and their demands. In the middle of September, Selig called the players' bluff, and he canceled the rest of the season and the World Series in an attempt to get public opinion away from the players' cause. But when that wasn't successful in getting the players to break ranks, he decided to take matters even further a couple months later. And in December, he and MLB decided to unilaterally implement the owner's proposal. And a few weeks later, owners started paying replacement players and threatened to start the season with scabs if the players didn't comply to their demands. But luckily for the Players Association, both of those moves would eventually get thrown out in court. And with the help of future Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor, the status quo was restored to baseball, and the players would return to the field in time for spring training. So just to recap Selig's handling of the situation, in one of his first main moves as commissioner, he needlessly antagonized the players' union, caused one of the biggest strikes in professional sports history, canceled the World Series for the first time in 90 years, cost MLB millions of dollars, and permanently scarred the public image of baseball. Not bad for a day's work. And the funniest part about all of this is that for all of that posturing and all of that effort that Selig put into trying to get his way, he got absolutely nothing that he or the owners wanted. Now, luckily for Selig, MLB would eventually recover what it lost in terms of revenue, attendance, and popularity. However, it did come at a cost, because the circumstances that led to this rebirth of baseball in the late 1990s would also lead to yet another black mark on the game's public image, and his mismanagement of the subsequent scandal would lead the game ever further downward. In 1998, Sammy Sosa and Mark McGwire put together two of the greatest offensive seasons in MLB history, and their race against each other to break the single-season home run record would end up captivating the entire country. They were the top story on SportsCenter every single night, their games were constantly on national television, and everybody would pack into the ballparks just for a chance to see them hit a home run. And it wasn't just them. All of a sudden it seemed like every player in MLB was bigger, stronger, and faster than ever. And it was generating a huge buzz around MLB that, just a couple of years ago, seemed completely dead. It was a summer that was largely credited with saving baseball after the disaster that was the 1994 players' strike. But it did not come without a cost, as we all know now what was happening back then. At the time, however, it was simply one of the worst kept secrets in all of sports. Everybody who had worked in and around the game knew just how prevalent steroids had become in locker rooms all around the country. And regardless of what he may have said at the time, there's no doubt in my mind that this included the commissioner. Now, at that point, there was still time for him to get out ahead of the situation and start implementing actual changes that would mitigate the problem. Implementing testing, issuing warnings, and making public statements that cheating wouldn't be tolerated. But of course, if he had done that, MLB would have been risking all the momentum and public support that they had finally won back, largely on the backs of all the players that were abusing steroids at the time. Revenue was up, attendance was up, and baseball was finally back in the forefront of American life again. And in Selig's eyes, that was worth more than doing the right thing in this scenario. And so, instead of doing something, he did nothing, and he prayed like hell that nobody would find out about it. But of course, because it was the worst kept secret in all of sports, it eventually did get out. And when that happened, everything completely blew up in Selig's face and in MLB's. When this happened, Selig attempted to save face by shifting hard in the opposite direction, cracking down on offenders, calling for congressional hearings, commissioning the Mitchell Report, and launching investigations into players like Alex Rodriguez that would become the stuff of legend for how disastrous they would end up turning out. Oh, hey there, Rob. But of course, at that point, it was too little too late. MLB attempted to act as if it was caught flat-footed, but nobody was buying it. Whatever good graces and trust that they had won back from the public was now completely gone. And honestly, there was no telling if MLB was ever going to win it back again. It was a major black mark on the game, an asterisk to be precise, and we're still dealing with the consequences of it to this very day. I mean, just think of how fucking awful it is every single year when we try to have the Hall of Fame debate. And that's largely because we didn't do anything about the steroid problem sooner. And a lot of the blame for that has to go on Commissioner Bud Selig. If we had started cracking down on this issue earlier, say the early 90s or late 80s, back in the heyday of guys like Canseco and McGwire, we'd have a completely different scenario now than we do currently. And baseball would certainly be a hell of a lot popular than it is today. But now, there's still not a whole lot of trust in Major League Baseball. And a lot of that has to do with the failures of the commissioner's office. But of course, at this point, I probably haven't told you anything that you haven't already heard before. We all know how big of a fiasco '94 was, and we all know how badly MLB butchered the steroid era. But even with how bad both of those debacles were for Major League Baseball, they still don't fully encapsulate what made Bud Selig such a bad commissioner, and what made him so dangerous for the sport of baseball in the long term. In order to actually do that, we actually have to look into what made him such a beloved commissioner in the first place. Given everything we've talked about in this video to this point, you'd probably expect that Selig would have been fired years ago for his mismanagement. And maybe in another universe, he would have been. But in this universe, he got to stay on as commissioner for 22 seasons. And in fact, he was rewarded with a spot in the Baseball Hall of Fame. So that begs the question, why did the owners keep him on for so long? And why do so many people see his tenure as a success to the point where he's now a Hall of Famer? Well, the answer is very simple. Just like everything in this world, the answer is money. For all his faults as a commissioner, the one thing that you couldn't deny about Bud Selig were his skills as a businessman. And he made MLB so much money while he was a commissioner. In fact, the one thing that people always turn to when they defend his tenure is the fact that MLB experienced unprecedented revenue growth while he was commissioner, which is true. But here's the thing. Those same business moves from 15 to 20 years ago that were making MLB so much money back then are now setting up MLB to fail. And in fact, a lot of our existential threats that we're facing as a league right now are directly tied to those short-sighted business moves from 15 to 20 years ago. Now, this isn't to say that MLB team owners doing whatever they can for profit is a new phenomenon, because of course it isn't. But what I'm saying is that there has been a definite change in how MLB has done its business dealings over the last 30 years or so. Previously, there was much more of a focus on the long-term growth and health of the game. It was generally understood that the best way of making money in sports was to put a good product out on the field and market it as widely as possible. So there was a huge focus on getting the game and its best players in front of as many eyeballs as possible, and making the game as accessible for as many people as possible. But shortly after Selig took over in the early 1990s, there was a definitive shift in MLB's mindset. A shift that went away from long-term growth and more towards short-term profits. Which of course made MLB a ton of money at the time, but set them up for some long-term consequences down the road. Of course, the team owners all went along with this because when you dangle profit in front of a businessman, of course they're going to take the bait. So yeah, of course, let's make a giant stadium in a place where nobody can get to using mostly public funds. That'll give us a perfect excuse to jack up the prices for tickets, souvenirs, concessions, and parking as much as possible. I mean, what are the fans gonna do? Not come to the games? We're MLB. Of course they're gonna come to the games. And hell, while we're at it, we may as well sign that $1 billion exclusive rights agreement with that regional sports network. I mean, sure, we do get great ratings on basic TV, and yeah, the fans are gonna have to pay $200 extra for the privilege of watching our games, but hey, what are they gonna do? Not watch us? You see the point I'm trying to get at here. Over the past 20 to 30 years, MLB has slowly but surely built a double-edged sword for itself. On one end, you have the existing fan base and their cities, which have been almost sucked dry of all of their resources and are slowly becoming more and more alienated with MLB. And on the other, you have potential fans, who could become lifelong fans and might actually love baseball. But they can't get into it because they're being priced out of the market, so why should they care about it? So when we talk about these supposedly modern issues of things like declining TV ratings, declining attendance, and declining national relevancy of MLB, these aren't actually modern issues. The foundations for these issues started long ago with the Selig administration, and unfortunately, they're continuing into the modern administration by his right-hand man, Rob Manfred. And in fact, a lot of people love to talk about Rob Manfred and how bad he's been as commissioner. And again, he has been a terrible commissioner. But what I think a lot of people fail to realize is that Rob Manfred isn't that much different from the Selig administration. In fact, I would go as far as to say that Rob Manfred is just Bud Selig, without the business ties, and without the PR. So while of course we should be criticizing Rob Manfred for his mismanagement and keeping him as accountable as possible, we also have to understand that 1, he is not responsible for every single problem that MLB has right now, and 2, he is not the answer to those problems either. Because at the end of the day, we're trying to solve a Bud Selig problem by throwing another Bud Selig at it. And the more we try to do that, the more loss we're going to get as a league. But with all that being said, I want to pass things back to you now. Do you think that Bud Selig is the worst commissioner that MLB has ever had? Do you think that Rob Manfred is going to be worse, or is he worse already? Let me know in the comment section down below. And while you're down there, be sure to leave a like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so that you're notified whenever we post new videos. And if you really like what we do and you want to support our channel, please consider contributing to our Patreon using the link down below. You'll get your name listed at the end of every single video going forward, access to an exclusive Discord server, and a free sticker when you sign up. Once again, thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.